Thanks for tuning into the channel. We're going to read a little bit of the translation I'm working on for Thomas Bradwardine's De Causa Dei from chapter 1. And if you remember from our last video on the preface, he's talking about the cause of God against the Pelagians of his day there in the 14th century. And he talks about a lot of times how they really return to philosophy as their stronghold, and they're not convinced by the arguments of Scripture. So what he does is in this first chapter here, he meets them on their own terms, and he takes them to task philosophically and theologically about God. And really, that's where he starts. This whole first chapter is basically two fundamental presuppositions that he establishes right here at the beginning of the chapter, and then there's 40 corollaries that follow from that. Some of them are very long, some of them are not as long, they're very short. But we're going to start here. I'm probably not going to read this entire work here on the channel, but I'm going to read parts of it. And I do want to start here with chapter 1 and just kind of go through what Thomas Bradwardine is saying here in the first at least 13 corollaries and parts to his two fundamental presuppositions he starts with. So beginning here in chapter 1, he starts with two fundamental presuppositions. Before proceeding, I establish two foundational principles. First, God is supremely perfect and supremely good, so perfect and so good that nothing greater, better, or more excellent can possibly be conceived. Second, there is no infinite regress among beings. Rather, in every order or genus of reality, there must be a first principle. The first presupposition, God as supreme perfection. The first principle is that God possesses such perfection and goodness that nothing more perfect or better can be conceived. This may be demonstrated in many ways, both philosophically and theologically, since God's perfection and goodness are absolutely infinite. Indeed, many of the greatest thinkers have acknowledged this truth. Hermes Trismegistus describes God as utterly complete and perfect, holy, incorruptible, eternal, and the highest good. Aristotle likewise speaks of God as the supreme and most fitting object of thought and attributes to him eternal existence and supreme excellence. Boethius writes, "Nothing better than God can be conceived." The same idea appears in the famous saying attributed to the 24 philosophers, quote, "God is that than which nothing better can be conceived," end quote. This is also the judgment of Anselm, who addresses God, quote, "We believe that you are that than which nothing greater can be conceived," end quote. Likewise, Richard of St. Victor observes that whatever people recognize as most excellent, they naturally attribute to God. Augustine teaches the same thing, quote, "No one who speaks of God conceives of him as something surpassed by another. Rather, all agree that God is that which stands above all else," end quote. Thus, Scripture itself declares, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. His greatness is without end." Psalm 145:3. Therefore, both reason and authority unite in affirming that God is the highest and conceivable perfection and goodness. So that's his first presupposition, and he'll refer back to that many times. Here's the second. The second presupposition, a first principle in every order of being. The second principle is that there cannot be an infinite regress among beings. Instead, every order of reality ultimately depends upon a first principle. This has been demonstrated elsewhere and is accepted by nearly all philosophers and by all theologians. Nevertheless, lest these principles appear to be asserted without justification, I will briefly indicate the reasoning behind them. So here he defines the object of inquiry. Let us designate by the letter A that being than which nothing more perfect or better can exist. Furthermore, let us understand possibility in the strictest sense. Something is possible when its existence involves no contradiction or impossibility in itself. Conversely, something is impossible when its very nature contains contradiction. Everything, therefore, must fall into one of these two categories, either possible or impossible. If the supremely perfect being is possible, it must exist necessarily. He goes on to say, now who would deny that such a being, A, is at least possible? Who, having understood the concept, would claim that it contains a contradiction? If A is possible, then something remarkable follows. A does not merely possibly exist, Rather, A must exist. Indeed, A exists necessarily. For a necessary mode of existence is more perfect than a merely contingent mode of existence. The philosophers distinguish between that which exists necessarily and cannot fail to exist, and that which may either exist or fail to exist. The former is clearly more perfect than the latter. This is especially true when speaking of the highest and most perfect good. For if the highest good could cease to exist, or could fail to exist, it would thereby lose perfection. Such loss would be an evil, and therefore incompatible with supreme perfection. Consequently, supreme goodness requires necessary existence. Pure act and necessary existence. Moreover, the perfect good must possess perfect actuality. It must be complete in goodness and free from every defect. It cannot depend upon unrealized potentiality, nor can it possess any susceptibility to corruption or loss. Yet the possibility of ceasing to exist implies precisely such imperfection. It implies unrealized potentiality. It implies a capacity for defect. It implies vulnerability to corruption. Therefore, the highest good must be pure actuality rather than a being capable of falling into non being. Necessary existence belongs to perfection itself. Necessary being is more perfect than contingent being. Who does not recognize that strength is superior to weakness? Who does not judge firmness superior to instability? Indeed, who would not acknowledge that supreme firmness belongs more fittingly to supreme perfection than mutability and uncertainty? In the same way, necessary existence is superior to merely possible existence. Reason itself testifies to this. Indeed, the human mind perceives it almost instinctively. And there probably it should say, necessary existence is superior to contingent existence. Aristotle on act and potency. Anyone who desires further confirmation may consult Aristotle. He teaches that actuality is prior to potentiality in perfection and substance, even if potentiality may precede actuality in certain temporal respects during processes of generation. Thus, actuality possesses a greater degree of perfection than mere potentiality. Accordingly, the highest and most perfect being cannot exist merely as a possibility, it must exist in the fullest actuality. Aristotle likewise teaches elsewhere that in good things, actuality is superior to mere potentiality, whereas in evil things, actuality is worse than mere capacity for evil. Thus he writes, quote, "The actual exercise of a good power is better and more honorable than the power itself, but in evil things the completed act is worse than the mere capacity for it," end quote. Again he says, quote, "Eternal substances are prior to corruptible ones," end quote. For nothing eternal exists merely as potentiality. The reason is that every potency includes the possibility of contrary outcomes. Whatever exists only potentially may either exist or fail to exist. Accordingly, whatever is merely possible is also capable of not existing. But whatever is capable of not existing is contingent, and whatever is contingent is, by that very fact, corruptible, either absolutely or at least with respect to the mode of being that belongs to it. Therefore, nothing that is absolutely incorruptible exists merely potentially. Whatever exists necessarily, and above all, the first being, cannot belong to the order of mere possibility. For if the first being were not necessary, it would ultimately amount to nothing at all. Reason itself also teaches this. That which exists through itself, depending upon nothing else, is by nature more perfect than that which depends upon another for its existence. Necessary being possesses this kind of independence, whereas merely possible being does not. Hence, Aristotle's interpreters, especially Averroes, and likewise Avicenna, teach that what exists necessarily has no cause within itself, whereas whatever is merely possible possesses a cause upon which it depends. Indeed, Avicenna argues that what exists necessarily admits of no equal and of no superior. Nothing precedes it. Rather, it is itself the first principle from which all other things derive. He also says elsewhere that necessary existence is perfect, indeed more than perfect. Therefore, if our supreme being, which we have designated by A, is possible, it follows that it is capable of existing in the most perfect manner. since necessary existence is more perfect than merely possible existence. A must be capable of existing necessarily, and necessarily through itself. For to possess goodness through one's own nature is more sufficient, more excellent, more perfect, and better than to possess goodness through another, to require another, or to depend upon another. This is evident to reason itself, and the philosophers cited above affirm the same. But if A can exist necessarily through itself, then A does in fact exist necessarily. Indeed, it belongs to the very nature of necessary being that it be necessary. Otherwise, it would be merely possible, which is impossible according to the definition of necessary existence. To say that A is a necessary being means precisely this, that it never could fail to exist, does not now fail to exist, and never will fail to exist. Whatever is once genuinely possible remains possible. Likewise, whatever is once necessary through itself remains necessary forever. For whatever involves no contradiction by its very nature can never later become contradictory. Likewise, whatever follows by absolute and formal necessity always follows. Such necessity cannot cease, because it is grounded in the very nature of the thing itself. Conversely, what is not formally and absolutely necessary never becomes so. If it could become absolutely necessary at some point, it would always have been absolutely necessary. Indeed, who can even conceive of a nature that is intrinsically possible being transformed into one that is intrinsically necessary, or the reverse? Consider further, whatever is called possible or capable is said to be so by virtue of some power. Either it possesses power in itself, or it is possible because another possesses the power to bring it about. Thus, future effects are called possible because active causes possess the power to produce them, and passive subjects possess the capacity to receive their action. An effect is therefore possible only because an active power is able to produce it. For how could anything be called possible through a power that has no ability to act? Or how could any effect ever come into existence if there were no power capable of producing it? But if anyone demands further proof of what is almost as evident as the sun itself, let him consult Averroes, who, teaching that something is called possible only in relation to an active cause, an agent, and a receptive subject, a patient, for it is impossible to say that something is possible with respect to the thing receiving the action, patient, while impossible with respect to the thing performing it, agent. Were that so, what is called possible would in fact be impossible. Therefore, every non-existent thing that is nevertheless called possible receives that designation because some active power is capable of bringing it into being. Now suppose that our supreme being, A, does not yet exist, but is nevertheless capable of existing. If so, it could only exist through some active power. Certainly, it could not exist through any power of its own, for as yet it would possess no existence and therefore no power at all. Nothing can bring itself from non-being into being. Every efficient cause is in some respect prior to its effect, at least by the order of nature, but nothing can be prior to itself. Consequently, if A were capable of existing while not yet existing, its existence would have to depend upon the power of another. Yet this is impossible. For as has already been shown, anything capable of producing A would necessarily be an active cause superior to it. But no such cause can exist. Everything other than A is by definition infinitely inferior to A and therefore incapable of producing it. Indeed, if A owed its existence to another, then A would no longer be that being than which nothing greater can be conceived. For it is far more perfect to exist through oneself than through another, to be wholly uncaused rather than caused, to depend upon nothing rather than upon another, and to be the first cause of all things rather than the effect of some higher cause. Therefore, A cannot receive existence from anything else. The same conclusion could be established by many other arguments as well. Hence, the supposition that A does not exist but nevertheless could exist involves a contradiction. Accordingly, it is both true and necessary that A is capable of existing, but only because it necessarily exists. It is therefore false, indeed impossible, to suppose that A does not exist. Consequently, it is both true and necessary that A exist. In other words, it is both true and necessary that God exists, and that he is so perfect and so good that nothing greater or better can possibly exist. The second supposition. The second principle follows naturally from the first. If God is the supremely perfect being, then he must also be the first and highest of all beings. For everyone recognizes that it is more perfect to be first than second, higher than lower, and supreme rather than equal to or dependent upon another. Should anyone require authority for this conclusion, Aristotle expressly teaches that what is above is nobler and more divine than what is below, and that which is prior is more excellent than what is posterior. Likewise, he repeatedly argues that within the same order of being, there cannot be several first principles of equal rank. There can only be one that is absolutely first. Thus, Scripture fittingly declares in Revelation 1:1, quote, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. So those are the two suppositions that Bradwardine lays out. And then he begins with a moral corollary drawn from the two suppositions containing 40 parts against 40 errors. Part 1, and some of these I've included more of like an easier kind of English heading where it's more of a summary. And then I've also below that included his longer subtitle, so to speak. So when I do that, I'll list both of them. Otherwise, I've just included exactly what Bradwardine has said. So part 1, against Protagoras, who doubts the existence of God. From these two principles, many who have wandered into various errors may, by God's grace, be led back to the path of truth, provided that truth itself goes before them as their guide. Accordingly, these principles refute the error of Protagoras, who, as Lactantius relates in his Divine Institutes, cast doubt upon the very existence of God. Part 2, against Diagoras and the foolish denying that there is a God. They likewise condemn Diagoras, who openly denied the existence of the gods, and they rebuke the fool described by the psalmist, who says in his heart, there is no God. Part 3, against those who deny God's absolute perfection. And this is more what Bradwardine says. That's how I've summarized it, against those who deny God's absolute perfection. Here's what he says. Against those who doubt or deny that God has really, equally, or supereminently any virtue and any goodness, and universally whatever is better to have than not to have, least of all to be good in every way, and to have all goodness, which is better to be, and have than not to be, and not to have, and to not have every vice and malice, and universally to not have everything that is better not to have than to have, or to have some habit in some other way, which not to have would be better than to have, or to have anything superfluously in vain, or not to always be happy, best, actual, or act, so that nothing could be happier, more blessed, or more actual. These same principles also refute all who admit that God exists, yet deny that he possesses every perfection in the highest and most eminent degree. They err who deny that God possesses every virtue, every excellence, every goodness, and indeed everything whose possession is better than its absence. For God is good in every conceivable way. He possesses every perfection whose possession is better than its lack. He is entirely free from every vice, defect, and evil. Nothing exists in him that would be better absent than present. Nothing superfluous, useless, or unfitting belongs to his being. Nor can he fail to be eternally and supremely blessed, perfectly happy, and wholly actual, so that nothing could possibly be happier, more blessed, or more fully actual than he is. For if any perfection were lacking in God, or if anything greater could be conceived, then something more perfect than God would be possible. But this contradicts our first principle that nothing can be more perfect or better than God. God is pure act. The same principle establishes that God is pure actuality. For actuality is more perfect than mere potentiality. Indeed, the actual exercise of a good power is more perfect than the power considered simply as a capacity. Since every power that belongs to God is necessarily good, it follows that in him there can be no unrealized potentiality. Rather, God is pure and perfect actuality. The first supposition itself makes this clear, and the arguments that follow will demonstrate it still more fully. Indeed, if God is supremely blessed and perfectly happy, he must also be supremely actual. For happiness consists not merely in possessing capacities or habits, but in their perfect exercise. Even the philosophers acknowledge this. Part 4, against those who deny God's infinity. And he says, against those who deny that God is simply infinite in the goodness and goodness of any being. These principles likewise refute those who deny that God's goodness and perfection are absolutely infinite. If any perfection in God were finite, it could be increased, but whatever admits of increase is capable of becoming better, If God could become better than he is, then he would not be the highest and most perfect good. This directly contradicts the first principle. The arguments that follow will make this even clearer. And here, Bradwardine talks about God's omnipotence. Because God's power is infinite, I hold to be true everything that mathematicians and philosophers demonstrate to be absolutely possible. Thus, mathematicians rightly suppose that a straight line may describe a circle, as is evident from the first book of Euclid's Elements. Likewise, natural philosophers correctly maintain that a continuum may be divided indefinitely. More generally, whatever logicians or anyone else describe as absolutely possible, that is, whatever involves no contradiction in itself, falls within the scope of divine omnipotence, even though it may exceed the powers of nature. For there is a distinction between what is impossible by nature and what is impossible absolutely. Whatever contains no contradiction is possible to God. Part 5. Against those who deny God's aseity. And his actual wording is, against those who say that God is not fully sufficient for himself, but needs another. These principles also overthrow those who claim that God is not fully sufficient in himself, but depends upon something outside himself. Such a position is plainly incompatible with our previous conclusions and with the first supposition. Self-sufficiency is itself a perfection. Therefore, the supremely perfect being must also be perfectly self-sufficient. Accordingly, Aristotle says concerning God, quote, he has no need of any external assistance or help, as earthly kings require because of their weakness, end quote. Elsewhere, he likewise teaches that nothing lacking belongs to God, nor is he in need of anything outside himself. The 24 philosophers express the same truth, quote, God exists eternally, and by necessity alone is abundantly sufficient unto himself, end quote. The same doctrine is reflected in one of the Hebrew names of God, Shaddai. As Rabbi Moses explains, this name signifies God's complete sufficiency. His essence depends upon nothing outside himself and requires nothing else for its perfection or stability. His own essence is entirely sufficient unto itself. Jerome, who was thoroughly versed in both Hebrew and Latin, likewise explains that Shaddai signifies the one who is mighty and all-sufficient, fully able to accomplish all things by his own power. Part 6. Against those who deny God's necessary perfection and immutability. And his actual wording is, against those who believe that God is not necessary, but contingently, supremely perfect in God, and that he himself is changeable, irascible, placable, sad, joyful, or susceptible to any other passion. Also, those who believe that God is an accidental name and not simply essential. Likewise, these principles refute those who maintain that God is not necessarily the supremely perfect God, but only contingently so. They likewise err who suppose that God is capable of change, that he may become angry, appeased, sorrowful, joyful, or subject to any other passion in the way creatures are. The same error is committed by those who regard the name God as merely accidental, rather than expressing his very essence. For it follows plainly from the first supposition that God is necessarily the supremely perfect being, and therefore necessarily God. Necessary perfection is greater and more excellent than contingent perfection, as was already demonstrated in establishing the first supposition. Indeed, if God were not necessary, the supremely perfect God, then it would be possible for him not to be so. But that supposition immediately refutes itself, just as we previously demonstrated in proving the first principle. Therefore, God is altogether immutable. He cannot change for the better because he already possesses every perfection in the highest degree. He cannot change for the worse because he necessarily possesses that supreme perfection. Nor can he change while remaining equally perfect. For what purpose could such a change serve? It could not improve his own condition, since nothing better can be added to supreme perfection. Nor could it preserve his own good, for such preservation would imply that his perfection required continual maintenance, contrary to his perfect self-sufficiency. If the change were for the sake of creatures, then God would still be acting for some need or deficiency with respect to his own condition, rather than from the fullness of his own perfection. That too is impossible, since God is entirely sufficient unto himself. Moreover, if God could exchange one equally good state for another, what principle would prevent him from exchanging it for one less good, even if such a loss were only temporary? He would no longer possess the fullness of all goodness at every moment. He would therefore cease to possess infinite perfection. This contradicts everything established above concerning God's supreme goodness. Furthermore, if God were capable of change, he would necessarily possess unrealized potentiality. But whatever possesses potentiality is not pure actuality. Therefore, God would cease to be pure act, contrary to what has already been demonstrated. From these same considerations, it also follows that the name God is not merely accidental, but expresses God's very essence. For if God merely designated an accidental quality, then God could cease to be God, or become God by change. But both possibilities have already been shown to be impossible. Part 7. Against those who deny God's omnipotence and impassibility. These same principles also refute those who deny that God is omnipotent in his activity and entirely incapable of suffering anything from another. That is, those who deny his impassibility. God's active omnipotence has already been established by preceding arguments. For active power is itself a perfection and therefore belongs supremely to God. Likewise, God cannot be acted upon by another. For if anything external could affect or suffer God, he would thereby become subject to change. But his immutability has already been demonstrated. Therefore, his impassibility follows necessarily from his immutability. Part 8. Against those who deny God's intellect, will, and the efficacy of his will. And he says this in larger terms. He says, against those who think that God is not a rational substance and power, having intellect and free will, actually knowing and willing, also thinking that the divine will is not universally effective, that is, not impedible, not thwarted, not defectible in any way. These same principles likewise refute those who deny that God is a rational substance, endowed with intellect and free will, actually knowing and actually willing. They likewise err who maintain that the divine will is not universally efficacious, that it can be hindered, frustrated, or in any respect fail to accomplish its purpose. For it follows plainly from the first supposition that God truly exists as a substance, since substance is more perfect than accident. It therefore follows that he is not merely a substance, but a rational one, for rationality is more excellent than irrationality. Consequently, he possesses both intellect and free will, as will also be demonstrated more fully in the third part of this work. Moreover, God knows and wills in actuality, not merely habitually or potentially, for actual knowledge and willing are more perfect than mere capacity, just as the exercise of a good act is more perfect than the mere power to perform it. It likewise follows that the divine will is universally efficacious in the sense described above, for a will that cannot be hindered, frustrated, or rendered ineffective is more perfect than one that can. Indeed, if God were to will something which nevertheless failed to occur, then he would not possess supreme blessedness and happiness, but would instead suffer deprivation. Yet by the principles already established, God can will nothing except what is just and good, and for that very reason he is supremely blessed. For who does not recognize that blessedness is the complete possession of perfect good? And who would deny that it is happier to possess what one rightly desires than to be deprived of it? If someone claims that the failure to obtain one desired object would not diminish happiness, then by the same reasoning neither would the failure to obtain two or three or indeed every desired object. But who would seriously maintain that a person who lacked everything he desired could still be perfectly happy? Only a fool could think so. Accordingly, the philosopher teaches in the Ethics that happiness is the good that is complete and self-sufficient. Likewise, Boethius, in the Consolation of Philosophy, defines happiness as, quote, that good which once attained leaves nothing further to be desired, end quote. It is therefore the highest of all goods, embracing every good within itself. For if anything remained outside it to be desired, it could no longer be the highest good. Blessedness, then, is nothing other than the perfect state resulting from the complete possession of every good. Who would deny that it is happier, more delightful, and more joyful to possess what one desires than to be unwillingly deprived of it? Every mind naturally acknowledges this, but supreme joy, delight, and happiness belong essentially to perfect blessedness. Since, as already established, God is eternally and supremely blessed, it follows that he is never deprived against his will of anything he wills. Furthermore, whoever wills an end but lacks the ability to accomplish it plainly lacks the highest power. If therefore God both wills some end and possesses the power to accomplish it, and nothing external prevents its accomplishment, then it necessarily comes to pass, as philosophy itself repeatedly affirms. Conversely, if God wills something that nevertheless does not occur, then either he cannot accomplish what he wills, or something stronger has prevented him. In that case, he could no longer be regarded as omnipotent, but rather as lacking power. This contradicts what has already been established concerning God's omnipotence. Accordingly, the 24 philosophers rightly define God in these words, quote, God is he whose will possesses creative and deifying power. Part 9. Against those who deny God's omniscience. These same principles likewise refute those who suppose that there is anything of which God is ignorant. Among those who seem to have fallen into this error are certain philosophers and even many ordinary people. Some have understood Aristotle to teach that God knows nothing outside himself. Likewise, Averroes, in his commentary, appears to argue that God has no knowledge of lowly or individual things, a view that Avicenna and Alguazil also seem to endorse. Cicero likewise denies that God possesses foreknowledge of future events. To this same error, Job alludes when he quotes the wicked as saying, quote, what does God know? Can he judge through thick darkness? Thick clouds veil him so that he does not see. He walks upon the vault of heaven, end quote. Likewise, the psalmist records their words, how can God know? In this quoting, is there any knowledge in the Most High? End quote. And again, quote, the Lord does not see. The God of Jacob does not understand, end quote. Yet all such errors are easily refuted by what has already been established. For wisdom, knowledge, and the ability to judge rightly, whether approving or condemning, are among the highest perfections. Moreover, as has already been demonstrated, God possesses actual knowledge. If he knows, then surely he knows himself. Indeed, it is plainly more perfect for a being to know itself than to be ignorant even of itself. Therefore, according to our first supposition, God necessarily knows himself. Furthermore, how could God be supremely blessed, as has already been demonstrated, if he had no awareness or knowledge of his own blessedness? Therefore, God knows himself. Nor does he know himself imperfectly or only in part. Rather, because of the principles already established, he knows himself perfectly and most perfectly, so that nothing could either know or be known more perfectly. He therefore knows himself according to his very essence, and according to every one of his attributes, relations, and perfections. Now there is no created thing over which God is not prior, higher, better, or more perfect, as our first supposition has already established. Nor is there anything of which God is not the first cause, the beginning, and the end, as even the philosophers acknowledge. Therefore, there is nothing whatever that God does not know distinctly and properly, for distinct knowledge is more perfect than confused knowledge. Again, either God knows that something besides himself exists, or he does not. If he does not know this, then since distinct knowledge is more perfect than confused knowledge, he must know creatures distinctly, and what holds for one creature holds equally for all. But if he does not know that anything besides himself exists, the absurdity is even greater. For he might then suppose that nothing exists except himself. He would therefore be deceived and fall into error, a conclusion utterly incompatible with God's perfection. Furthermore, since God knows himself perfectly, he also knows himself to be infinitely powerful, omnipotent, and possessed of a will that unfailingly accomplishes whatever it wills, as has already been shown. Accordingly, he knows that he is able to create, destroy, and govern realities outside himself, and when he does so, he acts knowingly rather than by chance, since he first knew that he both could and would perform these works. He necessarily knew beforehand that he would perform them. Therefore, he knew them from eternity, and what is true of one work is likewise true of all. Finally, if there were any truth unknown to God, he could desire to know it, for every rational nature naturally desires knowledge. If therefore God possessed a will that is always efficacious, he would be able to acquire knowledge that he previously lacked. But then he would not always be supremely actual, supremely wise, supremely perfect, supremely blessed, and altogether immutable. That conclusion contradicts everything already established. And then he responds to a denial of God's knowledge of particulars. Even though many created things may seem insignificant, the knowledge of them is nevertheless noble and worthwhile. The natural philosophers themselves recognize this whenever they devote careful study to animals, their members, and their generation, especially since such knowledge ennobles neither its objects nor, in some cases, even the one who possesses it. God, however, cannot be diminished or degraded by knowing things outside himself. Therefore, he knows every created thing perfectly and distinctly. Indeed, anyone who reflects more carefully will recognize that every nature, every created thing, and every essence, considered simply as what it is, possesses its own goodness and beauty, as even the philosophers acknowledge. Why then should it be unfitting for God to know what is good and beautiful? Or is it because these things are less good and beautiful than God himself? But if that were sufficient reason for ignorance, how could God create and order them by his omnipotence and his unfailingly efficacious will, as has already been demonstrated? Indeed, if it is fitting for human beings to know realities far inferior to themselves, how much more fitting is it for God to know the natures he himself has made? Furthermore, how could God render to every person according to his works if he were ignorant of their merits and demerits? Why then do we pray to God, if he cannot hear or understand our petitions? Indeed, is it not plainly better, more orderly, and more fitting that the God who transcends the whole universe should wisely govern all things, hear the prayers addressed to him, reward the righteous, and correct or punish the wicked? Were this not so, hope and love would lose much of their encouragement, fear would lose its restraining power, and the boldness of sinners would know no limits. The whole moral order of human life, both in relation to God and to our neighbor, would be thrown into confusion. If Aristotle intended to teach that God knows nothing beside himself, because everything other than God is insignificant in comparison with the divine majesty, the answer is readily given. Although every creature is indeed as nothing compared with God, that does not follow that God is ignorant of it. By the same reasoning, God would also be unable to create or govern anything outside himself, a conclusion already disproved by what has been established concerning his omnipotence. Likewise, Averroes, arguing that God cannot possess distinct knowledge of individual things because singulars are innumerable and therefore cannot be comprehended by knowledge, this argument likewise fails, whereas, as already been demonstrated, God is absolutely infinite, and so too are all his perfections. Indeed, God is infinitely greater than any infinite multitude of singular things that Averroes can imagine, whether belonging to one species or to every species taken together. For however great an infinite multitude one conceives, another greater collection may still be conceived by adding to it, whether from the same species or from another. One may even conceive of the whole multitude doubled, tripled, or multiplied without limit. Yet God is so infinitely great that nothing greater or more infinite can even be conceived. Accordingly, none of his perfections, including his knowledge, is limited by the multitude of things known. The infinite number of individual creatures does not overwhelm or exhaust the divine intellect. Rather, God's knowledge infinitely surpasses every conceivable multitude. Finally, some object that if God knew singular things, then his knowledge would necessarily change whenever those singulars changed. This objection would indeed hold if God knew creatures as human beings do, receiving knowledge from changing objects, and thereby undergoing change himself. But God's knowledge is nothing like ours, as has already been demonstrated. God is immutable. He knows creatures not by being passively informed by them, but actively and causally. His knowledge is like an eye that remains fixed while seeing the successive waters of a flowing river. The river changes, the eye does not. Well, that's the first 9 parts and the first 2 suppositions followed by the first 9 parts of chapter 1 of Thomas Bradwardine's De Causa Dei. Tune in for more. I've got up to part 14 translated, and we're working through it. Thanks for watching.